In October 1942, a British agent named Marcel Rousset was arrested in a cafe in Marseille. The Gestapo had been watching him for 11 days. They took him to a building on the Rue Paradoxe, sat him in a wooden chair under a single light, and searched everything he had on him: wallet, cigarettes, a small penknife, a coat with a torn lining, and a plain wooden pipe that he had been carrying for 3 months. The officer who searched him picked up the pipe, turned it over, looked into the bowl, pressed his thumb against the base. It felt solid. He set it down on the table and moved on. Inside that pipe was a compass needle embedded in the bowl lining, a folded silk map of the French Mediterranean coastline, and a coiled length of wire thin enough to slip between a man's fingers and strong enough to cut through a rope restraint in under 40 seconds. Rousset saw all of it sitting right there on the table. He said nothing. He watched the officer move on to the next item. He was taken to a cell. 3 nights later, he used the wire from the pipe to get through the restraints on his wrists. He was out of the building before dawn. He reached the coast. He made it back. The man who built that pipe never knew any of this happened. He was sitting in a small office in London, surrounded by half-finished objects and manufacturing invoices, drinking cold tea and arguing on the telephone with a cufflink manufacturer about the threadings on a particular screw fitting. His name was Charles Fraser-Smith. And before we go any further, you need to understand something about him, because it explains everything that follows. He was not a spy. He was not a soldier. He had never fired a weapon in combat, never jumped from a plane, never sat in an interrogation room with a forged name on his lips. He was a civil servant. His official title was a liaison officer in the Ministry of Supply's Clothing and Textile Department. If you had met him on the street in 1942, you would have assumed he was the kind of man who approved fabric orders and signed off on boot requisitions and went home for supper at 6. That was exactly the point, because underneath that cover, Fraser-Smith was running the most unusual weapons program in British history. He was building the tools that kept secret agents alive behind enemy lines. Not guns, not explosives. Something far harder to make and far more important. Objects that looked like nothing. Objects that passed through the hands of Gestapo officers and French milice and German border guards without triggering a single alarm. Objects that contained, hidden inside them, the exact tool a captured agent needed to survive. He would eventually produce over 250 separate devices. But in the autumn of 1940, when he first walked into that ministry office, he had none of that. He had an empty desk, a government budget that barely covered materials, and a problem that no one in Britain had seriously tried to solve before. Here is what the problem actually was. When Churchill created the Special Operations Executive in the summer of 1940, the directive was simple: send trained agents into occupied Europe, build resistance networks, sabotage German infrastructure, and do it all in secret. What Churchill did not say, because no one had fully worked it out yet, was how you keep those agents alive once they are on the ground. Because the reality of working in occupied France or the Netherlands or Norway in 1940 was this: you were one bad search away from everything ending. The Germans were not stupid. The Gestapo had informants in every city. The border controls were meticulous. An agent could have a perfect cover identity, a flawless accent, papers that would fool anyone, and then a routine street check would turn up something in their coat pocket that did not belong, and that was it. No second chances, no appeals. The agents who were caught in those early years were interrogated, and most of them did not come back. Britain needed a way to give agents tools they could carry through any search without detection. Escape tools, navigation tools, communication tools. Things that were genuinely invisible, not because they were hidden in a hollow heel or a false-bottom suitcase, which the Germans knew to look for, but because they looked and felt and behaved exactly like the ordinary objects they pretended to be. Fraser-Smith was handed this problem because of something that had nothing to do with intelligence work. Before the war, he had spent years in Morocco as a Christian missionary. He had built irrigation systems for villages that had no engineering resources. He had run small schools in towns where books did not exist. He had solved practical problems every single day using materials that were never meant for the job, in conditions where failure meant real harm to real people, and where the solutions had to be invisible because the local authorities could not know what he was actually building. He was not a spy. He was a man who had spent a decade learning how to hide the true function of a thing inside its ordinary appearance. That is a very specific and very rare skill, and in 1940, it was exactly what British intelligence needed. When he was first briefed on the program, Fraser-Smith asked one question that his contact at the ministry remembered for the rest of his life. He did not ask about budget. He did not ask about timelines or security protocols or the chain of command. He asked, when one of your agents is caught and searched, what does the officer actually do? How does he search? What does he look for? What does he overlook? Nobody had a precise answer, so Fraser-Smith went and found out. He spent 2 weeks interviewing returned agents, reading interrogation reports, studying German search protocols that had been obtained through other intelligence channels. He built in his mind an exact picture of what happened in the 30 seconds between an agent being stopped and an officer deciding whether to arrest them or wave them through. He mapped every point of failure. He identified every object that drew attention and every object that did not. And then he went to work. The first principle he established was one that sounds obvious once you hear it, but that almost nobody was applying at the time. The best hiding place is not a secret compartment. The best hiding place is the object itself. If a compass is hidden inside a hollow button, a thorough search will find it. But if the compass needle is embedded inside the lining of a pipe bowl, made from a material that looks and feels identical to the surrounding material, a thorough search will not find it, because there is nothing there that looks like a hiding place. There is only a pipe. He applied this principle to everything he built. A hairbrush with a removable base that required a specific quarter-turn counterclockwise to open, threaded in the opposite direction to any standard fitting, so that a guard pressing and twisting the base, the normal way, would feel solid resistance and assume it was a single piece. A set of chess pieces with maps printed on silk, so thin it compressed to nothing inside a hollow pawn. Shoelaces woven from signal wire that could transmit a coded message if connected to a specific type of receiver. A fountain pen that wrote normally, carried normally, clicked normally, and contained in its barrel a set of lockpicks machined to tolerances that Fraser-Smith had to argue 3 separate manufacturers into accepting, and the reverse thread. This became his signature. Any container in his workshop that had a screw fitting was threaded backwards. Every single one. Because a German officer who found a suspicious-looking container would try to open it the standard way, feel that it would not move, and conclude it was solid. To open it, you had to know to turn it the other direction. That single mechanical inversion, that one small reversal of expectation, passed through hundreds of searches without being detected once. Fraser-Smith never knew which of his objects saved which agent. He was not told operational details. He built things, handed them over to his contact at the SOE, and received new requests. Sometimes those requests arrived as precise specifications. More often, they arrived as single sentences. Build something a man can hide on his body that will tell him which direction is north. Build something a woman can carry in her handbag that a German officer will not give a second look. Build something that can cut through a rope in the dark with one hand. He solved each one. But in late 1942, a request arrived that was different from anything he had received before. It was not a specification. It was a question. Delivered by telephone from a contact he knew only by a code name. The question was this: could Fraser-Smith build a metal container large enough to hold a full-grown adult human body, completely watertight, capable of surviving immersion in cold Atlantic seawater, and light enough to be loaded onto a standard military transport aircraft without specialist equipment? Fraser-Smith asked what it was for. The contact said he could not be told. Fraser-Smith sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he said he would need the exact dimensions. The contact gave him a height and a weight. Fraser-Smith wrote them down. Then he hung up, looked at the numbers on his notepad, and understood that he was not building an escape device this time. He was building something for a dead man. The body had a name: William Martin. Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, serial number 148228. Next of kin, listed as his father, John Martin, of Cardiff, Wales. He had a photograph of a woman named Pam in his wallet. He had a letter from his bank threatening to collect on an overdraft of £79. He had a receipt from a London jeweller for an engagement ring he had apparently just purchased. He had a letter from his father, written in the slightly stiff way that fathers write to sons they are proud of, but do not quite know how to tell. William Martin did not exist. He was a fiction assembled by two British intelligence officers named Ewan Montague and Charles Cholmondeley, working out of a basement office in London under a programme called Operation Mincemeat. The plan was this: the Allies were preparing to invade Sicily in the summer of 1943. Germany knew an invasion of southern Europe was coming, but did not know where. If German high command could be convinced that the real targets were Greece and Sardinia rather than Sicily, they would move their defensive forces to the wrong locations. The actual landing would face a fraction of the resistance it would otherwise encounter. Historians would later estimate that getting this wrong could have cost the Allies 40,000 additional casualties on the beaches. To make the Germans believe the wrong target, British intelligence needed to plant false documents on them in a way that made those documents impossible to dismiss. Not delivered by an agent, not intercepted through a channel the Germans might suspect. Found, accidentally, in circumstances that had nothing to do with British intelligence. The method they chose was this: they would dress a dead body in a British officer's uniform, attach a briefcase to its wrist containing top-secret letters indicating that the real invasion targets were Greece and Sardinia, and release it from a submarine off the coast of Spain. Spain was officially neutral, but had a German intelligence presence known to pass everything to Berlin. A Spanish fisherman finding a drowned British officer with a briefcase full of classified documents would hand the body to local authorities. The Germans would access the contents, and they would believe it completely, because nobody plants documents on a corpse and releases it into the Atlantic Ocean. Nobody does that. It is not a thing that happens, except it was about to happen, and the entire operation depended on a container that Montague and Cholmondeley could not build themselves. The body needed to be preserved, not indefinitely, long enough. A decomposed or visibly damaged body would raise immediate questions about the timeline of death and the authenticity of the documents. A body in good condition, dressed correctly, with the right papers and the right personal effects, would be accepted without serious challenge. To keep the body viable for the journey from London to the Spanish coast by submarine, they needed a sealed container engineered to precise temperature specifications, capable of surviving the pressure changes of a submarine dive, openable from the outside by submariners working in a confined space in the dark. That was the phone call Fraser-Smith had received. He built the canister in 6 days. Steel construction, dry ice cooling, a pressure compensation system he designed from scratch after identifying a flaw in the original specification that would have damaged the body during descent. The sealing mechanism required 3 separate iterations before he was satisfied that it could be operated by a man wearing cold water gloves in a submarine corridor without specialist training. He delivered it on time. He asked no further questions about what it was for because he already understood. On April 19th, 1943, HMS Seraph surfaced off the coast of Huelva in southern Spain before dawn. The canister was opened. Major William Martin was placed in the water and carried toward shore by the current. A Spanish fisherman found the body that morning. Within 48 hours, German intelligence in Madrid had photographed every document in the briefcase. Within a week, the photographs were in Berlin. Within 2 weeks, Adolf Hitler had personally authorized the transfer of an entire Panzer division from Sicily to Greece. On July 10th, 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily and faced a beach defense that was a fraction of what it should have been. The campaign succeeded faster and at lower cost than any realistic projection had predicted. One of the most strategically decisive deceptions in the history of modern warfare had worked completely. And it had worked in part because a man in a London office had solved a pressure differential problem on a steel canister in an afternoon and asked no questions about why. Fraser-Smith read about Sicily in the newspaper. He did not know his canister had anything to do with it. He was already working on something else. Now here is the part of this story that gets left out every time someone writes about the gadgets, because the gadgets are easier to describe than the man. Fraser-Smith was not a soldier. He was not trained to separate himself from the consequences of his work, the way soldiers are trained to do. He was a man who had spent years in Morocco building irrigation channels and running schools for children who had nothing, driven by a faith that was specific and serious and not decorative. And he was now spending his days engineering concealed cyanide capsules, sabotage devices disguised as everyday objects, and tools designed to help people kill without being caught. There is one account from a colleague who worked in the same building during 1943. He recalled that Fraser-Smith sometimes sat completely still at his desk between tasks. Not reading, not writing, just sitting. The colleague assumed he was working through an engineering problem in his head. He may have been right, but the same colleague also noted that these moments happened most often on the days when Fraser-Smith received a new request involving what he called terminal devices. The man who built things to help people escape was also being asked, with increasing frequency, to build things that served a different purpose entirely. He kept going regardless. Every morning, every request, every problem that arrived as a sentence and left his office as an object that looked like nothing. And then, one afternoon in the spring of 1944, a man Fraser-Smith knew from the edges of the intelligence world came to his office unannounced and sat down across the desk without being invited to. His name was Ian Fleming. He was a naval intelligence officer, 35 years old, with the kind of confidence that comes not from achievement, but from having always assumed that rooms belong to you. He had a cigarette in his hand and a notebook in his jacket that he did not take out during the conversation, but that Fraser-Smith noticed immediately. Fleming said he was not there in any official capacity. He said he was curious about the work. He asked Fraser-Smith to describe what he actually did, not the cover version, the real version. Fraser-Smith looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up an object from his desk. It was a standard-looking pen. Black barrel, gold clip. The kind of thing that sat in a breast pocket without attracting any attention at all. He handed it to Fleming and told him to try to open it. Fleming turned it over, uncapped it, pressed the clip, twisted the barrel the standard way. Nothing moved. He looked up. Fraser-Smith told him to try the other direction. Fleming twisted it the opposite way. The base separated cleanly, and a set of 4 lockpicks, machined to tolerances that had taken 3 weeks to get right, slid into his palm. Fleming looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at Fraser-Smith. He did not say anything immediately. He just turned the pen over in his fingers, the way a man does when he is memorizing the weight of something. He stayed for 2 hours. He asked about the reverse thread principle. He asked about how Fraser-Smith decided which object to use as a shell for which device. He asked about failure, specifically whether any of his objects had ever been found. Fraser-Smith said he did not always know, because he was not told operational outcomes. Fleming wrote nothing down during the conversation. He thanked Fraser-Smith when he left. He did not come back. 8 years later, in 1952, Fleming published a novel called Casino Royale. The main character was a British intelligence agent named James Bond. In the third novel, Fleming introduced a character who ran a workshop inside the British intelligence service and supplied Bond with devices that looked ordinary and performed the impossible. He was irritable, precise, unimpressed by dramatics, and interested only in whether a thing worked. Fleming called him Q. Fraser-Smith read the novels. He recognized the workshop. He recognized the philosophy. He did not contact Fleming. He was still bound by his secrecy obligations, and beyond that, he was simply not the kind of man who sought recognition for things he had done under instruction. He would remain silent for another 30 years. But in 1944, the war still had a year to run, and the request that was waiting for him when Fleming left his office that afternoon was unlike anything he had been asked to build before. Not because of its technical complexity. He had solved harder engineering problems, but because of what the object was intended to do, and because for the first time since he had taken this position, Fraser-Smith was not certain he could justify doing it. He sat at his desk for a long time after reading the specification. Then he picked up his pen, the real one, not the one with the lockpicks, and began to write back. The specification that arrived on Fraser-Smith's desk in the spring of 1944 was 4 lines long. It asked for a device small enough to fit inside a standard-issue German military uniform button. It needed to be undetectable by touch or visual inspection. It needed to be capable of releasing a chemical compound on contact with moisture. And the compound in question was not a sedative. It was not a tracking agent. It was not something designed to incapacitate. It was designed to kill. Fraser-Smith set the paper down. He read it again. Then he walked to the window and stood there for several minutes, looking at the street below, at the people moving through their ordinary day with no idea what was being decided in rooms above them. He had built escape tools. He had built the canister for a dead man and asked no questions. He had built lockpicks inside fountain pens and compasses inside pipe bowls and 100 other objects whose purpose was to bring people home alive. But this was different in a way he could not engineer his way around. This was not a tool for survival. This was a weapon designed to end a specific life, delivered not by a soldier in open combat, but by an agent in a room. At close range, in a moment, the target would never see coming. He went back to his desk. He wrote 2 questions to his contact. First, was this request sanctioned at the level that authorized lethal devices? Second, was there an alternative solution that would achieve the operational objective without a purpose-built killing instrument? The answer to the first question came back within a day. Yes, fully sanctioned. The answer to the second question did not come back at all. Fraser-Smith built the device. He never described what it felt like to make that decision. No diary entry, no letter, no recorded conversation in which he addresses it directly. What he said in later interviews was this, that once authorization was confirmed, the engineering problem was the only thing he allowed himself to think about. He said it in a flat tone that the people who interviewed him found slightly uncomfortable, because it was not the tone of a man who had made peace with something. It was the tone of a man who had made a decision, built a wall around it, and never gone back to look at what was on the other side. 3 weeks after Fraser-Smith delivered the button device, a French resistance courier named Sylvie Arnaud was stopped at a German checkpoint outside Bordeaux. She was 24 years old. She had been in the field for 7 months. She was carrying forged papers, a message concealed in a hollow coat button, and a second button on her left sleeve that she had been told never to use unless she was already inside a German facility with no other exit. She was taken inside the checkpoint building. She was not released. What happened in that building is not fully documented. What is documented is that the German officer who had detained her was found dead of cardiac arrest 2 hours later, that Arnaud was seen crossing the border into unoccupied territory by nightfall, and that the message she had been carrying reached its destination the following morning. The medical examiner who examined the German officer noted an unusual small mark on the inside of his wrist, consistent with brief skin contact with a foreign compound. The report was filed and not followed up. Fraser-Smith was not told about Sylvie Arnaud. He was not told about the German officer. He received a single line from his contact 3 days later that said only, "Device functioned as specified." He put the note in his file and moved on to the next request. This is what the work actually was. Not gadgets in a showcase. Not a laboratory of gleaming equipment. It was this. A man receiving a 4-line specification, building a thing that looked like nothing, and then receiving a 3-word confirmation that a human being was dead, and then picking up the telephone to argue with a manufacturer in Birmingham about the threading on the next order. He did this for 5 years. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Fraser-Smith cleared his desk, handed over his files, and returned to civilian life. He took a position in agricultural development. He moved into a house in the English countryside. He did not speak about any of what he had done. Not to neighbours, not to colleagues, not to his wife in any detail, she later recalled. Not to his children at all. His son David grew up knowing that his father had worked for the Ministry of Supply during the war. Administrative work, his father had said. Procurement, fabric and clothing. Nothing interesting. David believed this completely, because his father was genuinely not a dramatic man, and because nothing in his manner suggested he was carrying anything unusual. David remembered his father as quiet, methodical, deeply religious. Someone who fixed things around the house with a precision that seemed slightly excessive for domestic repairs. A man who, when something did not work, would sit with it in silence until he understood exactly why, and then fix it exactly right, and never mention it again. David did not know that his father had spent 5 years building instruments that passed through the hands of Gestapo officers. He did not know about the canister, or the button, or the wall. He found out when his father's memoir was published in 1981, in the same way the rest of the world found out. He read it at the kitchen table. He said later that he sat there for a long time after finishing it, not knowing what to do with the distance between the man he thought he knew and the man described in those pages. Fraser-Smith was asked in an interview shortly after the book's publication whether the secrecy had been difficult, whether 30 years of silence about something that significant had cost him anything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the secrecy had not been the hard part. The hard part had been something else, something he had not written about in the book and did not plan to. He said he had thought about it for a long time and concluded that some things are better left as weight than as words. The interviewer pressed him. Fraser-Smith looked at the table and did not answer. The interview moved on. In 1952, Ian Fleming published Casino Royale. A decade later, the Bond films turned Q into a global icon. Audiences in 100 countries watched a dry, precise man hand impossible objects to a British agent and say, "Pay attention." They laughed at the character. They loved him. They had no idea he had been built from observation of a real man sitting in a small office, arguing about screw threads on the telephone, with a 4-line specification on his desk and a wall in his mind that he never looked behind. Fraser-Smith died in 1992. He was 88 years old. The obituaries mentioned James Bond. A few mentioned the gadgets. One mentioned that he had been a missionary in Morocco before the war, which the journalist appeared to find slightly incongruous with the rest of the story. It was not incongruous. It was the whole explanation. A man who had spent years in a foreign country solving impossible problems with inadequate materials, hiding the true function of things inside their ordinary appearance, in service of something he believed was worth doing, even when nobody would ever know he had done it. That was not a contradiction. That was a single coherent life, running in a straight line from a village in Morocco to a steel canister in the Atlantic to a button on a dead German officer's sleeve. The agents who came home never met him. They never knew his name. They just knew that the hairbrush worked and the compass pointed north and the thread turned the wrong way, and they walked across the bridge without looking back.